Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the Co-opting AI series on this beautiful fall day, at least here in Virginia, in Charlottesville, where we have beautiful fall leaves at the moment and wonderful sunshine. Today, we are talking about something fundamental to human life and human culture, actually, the design and construction of building. Welcome to Co-opting AI Architecture. My name is Mona Sloane. I am a sociologist of artificial intelligence and the host of the Co-opting AI series. I'm an assistant professor of data science and media studies at the University of Virginia, where I run my research group, Sloane Lab, that looks at the social implications of artificial intelligence. I'm extremely grateful for the wonderful support that I receive for the Co-opting AI series. Our partners are the UVA Karsh Institute of Democracy and the NYU Institute for Public Knowledge. As usual, big thanks to both teams for making these conversations possible. Before I start the show today, I want to acknowledge that the land that we here at UVA learn and work on is the homeland and traditional territory of the Monacan Indian Nation. We pay respect to the elders and knowledge keepers, past and present, and we also acknowledge and pay respect to the enslaved Africans, enslaved laborers, and free Black laborers who built the University of Virginia, as well as their descendants. Now, architecture. Some argue that architecture is as old as humanity, or that designing and constructing a dwelling or even more complex built communities is what makes us human. Architecture has always been a profession with authority. Like doctors and lawyers, architects practice. Architects may or may not see themselves as workers, and they have seen their profession be characterized by stark inequalities, some of which are still not remedied. And importantly, they have for the longest time used math and technology to engage in their practice. Today, unsurprisingly, AI systems are deeply embedded into architectural practice, shoring up new and old questions around data, technology capabilities, authorship of design, and many more. One of the biggest questions the case of AI in architecture brings up, at least for me, is actually about infrastructure. Has AI become infrastructural to how we quite literally build stuff? There are very few people who are better positioned to ponder these comments and questions and more than my expert guests today. Please join me in welcoming Molly Wright Steenson, Jay Cephas, and Phil Bernstein. Now, beginning today will be Molly Wright Steenson, who is the CEO and president of the American Swedish Institute, a 95-year-old museum and cultural institution. She's also an associate professor at Carnegie-Mellon University in the School of Design, where she's currently on leave to do her important work at the museum. She is an internationally recognized author, historian, and designer whose research interests include AI, architecture, design, and craft practices. She is the author of Architectural Intelligence: How Designers and Architects Created the Digital Landscape, and the co-edited book Bauhaus Future, both out with MIT Press. From 2015 to 2023 at Carnegie-Mellon, she was vice provost for faculty and held the inaugural K&L Gates Associate Professorship in Ethics and Computational Technologies. She holds a PhD in architecture from Princeton University. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you.
Following Molly will be Dr. Jay Cephas, who is an assistant professor in the history and theory of architecture and the J. Maclean Junior University Preceptor at Princeton University. He is also a research director at the Princeton-Mellon Initiative in Architecture, Urbanism, and the Humanities. His research concerns the intersection of labor, technology, and social identity in the built environment. He has a book forthcoming called Fordism and the City, and that book examines the extended urbanization formed in the wake of industrial mass production in the early 20th century. Jay is also the founding director of the Black Architects Archive, an interactive repository that documents the work of Black architects, builders, landscape architects, and contractors working across the 19th and 20th century. Welcome, Jay. Thanks for joining us. Closing us out today will be Phil Bernstein, who is the Deputy Dean and Professor at the School of Architecture at Yale, where he teaches courses in professional practice, project delivery, and technology. He was formerly a vice president at Autodesk, where he was responsible for setting the company's AEC vision and strategy for technology. Prior to joining Autodesk, Phil practiced architecture as an associate principal at Caesar Pelli and Associates, where he managed many of the firm's most complex commissions, including projects for Reagan National Airport and the Mayo Clinic, as well as UCLA and Goldman Sachs. He writes extensively on issues of architectural practice and technology, and his books include Architecture Design Data, Practice Competency in the Area of Computation, and Machine Learning, Architectural Futures in the Era of Artificial Intelligence. He has been honored twice by Design Intelligence as one of the 30 most admired educators in architecture and is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He received his Bachelor of Arts and Masters of Architecture from Yale and is licensed to practice in California. You see why these folks are best positioned to be talking about all things AI, society, and architecture. A few words on logistics. As per usual, our panelists will give their short presentations / provocations, and then we will engage in a discussion. You are very encouraged to put your questions and comments into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will weave these into the conversation as we go. And with that, I'm going to shut up and toss it over to Molly. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much. I'm going to talk about generativity, history, power, and control. As mentioned, I'm the president and CEO of the American Swedish Institute, which looks rather like this. And I'm also the author of Architectural Intelligence, which looks rather like this. There are Swedish connections between what I'll talk about today and a couple of Swedish frameworks. So there are ways that I'm using Swedish human values and AI practice as a part of what I'm doing here, leading this cultural institution. My book, Architectural Intelligence, looked at a number of different things. It's also a book that used a lot of male and white figures that I would probably rethink the choice of today. I'm not going to go into that in this talk, but I do want to point out that the book handled the history of AI, cybernetics, computer scientists and world building, ethics and rhetoric, and defense funding in AI winters, among other things. One thing that I think becomes apparent is that the history of AI is dangerous to those who claim that AI is new. And I'll come back to that here. I'd like to think of what Shelby Doyle says, who's a professor at Iowa State University, that we're all a part of a lineage or dozens of lineages. How can each of us work within or against these lineages of knowledge? And she's saying this from an architectural and a feminist standpoint. This is something I'm going to come back to in this brief talk. When we're looking at how we talk about AI, one thing is bound up in it, and that is always the question of its newness. So if you plug this into Google, these are some of the things you get. AI is the new electricity, AI is the new black, the new UI, and so on and so forth. And the fact is, AI isn't new at all. It was coined in 1955 by these individuals who were working together at doing the Dartmouth conference at Dartmouth University one summer, where they laid out a platform of research for AI. They termed it making a machine behave in ways that would be called intelligent if a human were so behaving. J.C.R. Licklider referred to the concept of symbiosis. A lot of time when we talk about AI, we're talking about human-computer symbiosis. So he defined it as a very close coupling between human and electronic members of the partnership in 1960. And Marvin Minsky in 1961 said, "We're on the threshold of an era that will be strongly influenced by and quite possibly dominated by intelligent problem-solving machines." And that was in 1961. This even was a series of, this was a topic for conferences like the Architecture and Computer Conference. Minsky spoke at that as well, saying that in no more than 30 years, computers might be more intelligent than people, and that eventually computers will evolve formidable creative capacity. Of course, we could look at something like this article from 2023 that says it's already way beyond what humans can do. Will AI wipe out architects? And that was a concern back in 1964 for those architects in that room in Boston, as it is today. We all wonder, what is the role of AI, and especially generative AI? And there have been something like 2,500 new articles about generative AI written in the New York Times and similar publications, excuse me, in the last year alone. But I want to point out that generative AI is not new in architecture, that there's long been this kind of cycle of computers used for calculation and then computers used for representation, giving rise to an idea about generativity. For example, the building optimization program that Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill created in 1968. And this is part of a lineage of calculation and computation that goes back to the 1950s at places like SOM. Or representation, using computation to represent design problems for human use. So this is Sketchpad, the two-dimensional version, and Sketchpad, the three-dimensional version in 1962 and 1963. And then we come to different notions of generativity as early as 1963. I'm going to be moving very quickly here, but I just want to give a nod to the work of Cedric Price and Joan Littlewood. This is the Fun Palace, which was a proposal for a cybernetic theater. If you look at the middle image, you'll see the flow chart, you'll see something that says input of unmodified people, output of modified people. The idea is humans would interact with this huge, huge space, and it would come to adapt to their needs. And this was an idea for a radical theater. Joan Littlewood was a radical theater director who collaborated closely with Cedric Price on this project. Or you might consider a project like Cedric Price's Generator. By some in the 1980s, this was considered to be the first artificially intelligent building project. A set of cubes that could be recombined, a proposal, I should say, for a set of cubes that could be recombined in an arts retreat space in northern Florida. And one element of this was Cedric Price's collaboration with Julia and John Fraser for a set of programs and plotters that could be used for Generator. And they had an interesting idea about how these programs could be used with the cubes that Generator would have. Not only would there be inventory or modeling, but a boredom program that if you didn't move around the parts of Generator enough and recombine them enough, it would come up with with its own new layouts. It would generate them. And as Julia and John wrote, if you kick a system, the very least that you would expect it to do is kick you back. We could, of course, look at the work of the Architecture Machine Group at MIT between 1970 and 1984, where it then folded into the MIT Media Lab and became a part of the Media Lab with things like chatbot-based, what we'd call today a chatbot-based approach on Urban 5, or the Mapping by Yourself digital maps, or the Aspen Movie Map, which was an immersive way to drive down the streets of a remote location, in this case, Aspen, Colorado. These projects, especially Mapping by Yourself and Ask Movie Map, were of course funded by the Department of Defense. So we see that AI is old, and we know that generative AI is old, but large language models are new, and this changes the game. And large language models are the massive amounts of text that are used and trained to create generative AI, to create things that are new or that appear that they want to, that appear that they are the creation of humans. And this was the thing that shifted me from being optimistic about AI to a little less so. An article that the New York Times published back in April about the way that tech giants are cutting corners and harvesting data, trying to pull all of the text from published books or articles, one of the things that Meta had tried to do was to potentially purchase Simon & Schuster just to get access to that data. And that's what you see here. And Sam Altman saying that all of the data on the internet would run out and there would not be sufficient data to train models. So what you see here is that ethics, regulation, and penalties do not matter to the major tech companies in this race. And it has a direct impact on designers and architects too, whose images and whose visual creation is being hoovered up and and the copyrights are not being heeded. What is at stake for these large companies is creating the largest models they can, the most powerful large language models they can, to compete against one another. And they want to build it as quickly as possible. As Simon Lindgren says, who's a professor of sociology at Umeå University and the author of the very excellent book, Critical Theory of AI, this is a game of power. When we see AI as driven by ideology, as he argues that it is, we are propelled forward by a specific view on the world that construes AI as superior, unavoidable, and as a catch-all solution for society. And if there is a technological problem, the impact would be just create more technology, put more technology on it. And this is a page from OpenAI's website that says planning for AGI and beyond. So the question here is one of artificial general intelligence, AI systems generally smarter than human, and they're claiming that they want to protect humanity. But the other way to see this is, are they so big that they say they are the only ones who can protect humanity because they're the ones who created the model? It's a snake eating its tail. So the truth is, this is about power and control. And two, AI has a history of AI winters and a history of AI's failures. And it's, I think, useful to look at what Gary Marcus has written about the history of AI's failures, the AI winters over the years, that we could see a massive gut-wrenching correction, and we're building our entire global and national policy on the premise that generative AI will be world-changing in ways that may, in hindsight, turn out to have been unrealistic. And three, finally, calling AI new is about power and control. If there's no history to AI, all you can do is build more technology. As Cedric Price once said, technology is the answer. What was the question? And that's what I'd ask here. Thank you. And onward.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I'm following a hard act, following Molly here. But as a historian, I think I'm going to build on some of those historical themes that she laid out. Before I begin, I do want to thank Mona for inviting me to the session today, and thank everyone whose labor contributed to making this happen. So I'm an architectural historian and an urban historian, and I'm interested in the relationship between the architecture, labor, and automation. And that's going to structure my presentation today. And as I put forth some questions regarding the nature of that relationship. Okay, you don't need the sound for that. So nearly 100 years ago, nearly 100 years after its debut, Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times is still iconic. It debuted in 1936, more than 20 years after the introduction of the automated assembly line. the introduction of this assembly line to factory work in the United States. Though, despite a catastrophic economic depression, the assembly line kept the economy moving, figuratively and literally, its pace so unyielding as to be a kind of farce, which is exactly how Chaplin portrays it in modern times. Chaplin plays a worker struggling to keep up with the automated assembly line. His co-workers seem to manage the pace, but not Chaplin, who in a fit of insanity insists on turning every single widget, and in doing so, he gets pulled into the machine and literally caught in the gears of industry. All the while, he continues working, and he literally cannot even stop, even once the factory manager notices his plight, reverses the assembly line, and pulls Chaplin out. So the story of automation is old, yet the questions and concerns surrounding it remain the same, and rightly so. The history of human-machine interaction on the worksite is one of humans being subsumed, and in this case, literally swallowed up by the mechanisms of machines. And these concerns remain today as we're confronted with the advance of AI, although I'm learning from Molly that I should not say that it's new, but there's new questions that I think arise, and maybe that's kind of what I'm engaging with here. Though AI might seem quite different from the kind of automation that Chaplin derided in his satire, it falls squarely within the history of automation, which is essentially a history of the transfer of labor from humans to machines. Early on, this transfer focused on mechanizing human movements, and in doing so, wrapping up speed as through the automated assembly line. In this context, humans were expected to match the speed and output of machines. When automation turned to the integration of robot machines, these machines were tasked with the 3Ds that are often sort of talked about in robotics. Human work that was considered dull, dangerous, or dirty. There's sort of multiple 3Ds that people kind of attend to, but they all sort of point to the kinds of work that most humans don't want to do, or that's undesirable work for humans to engage in. So the promise of robots was that they would free us from undesirable labor, specifically from undesirable physical labor. Now with AI, we're faced with the capacity of machines to automate not just physical labor, but intellectual labor and creative labor. So today, AI and robotics are undoubtedly changing the way that we work. And sort of a lot of the debate, as we all know, around AI is about how work is going to change or how it's changing already. So it's impacting the way we design, construct, and occupy buildings. So an image like this is always interesting to me, the image of the architect sort of hunched over the drawing table, hard at work. And this image, interestingly, is still used a lot, even to this day, to sort of represent the work of architecture, despite the fact that architects haven't worked like this for decades, at least at this point. The automation of architectural work forever changed the field with the introduction of CAD in a sort of a broad way in the 1980s, but even reaching back before that. Since then, the application of advanced computing and now AI to various domains will likely bring across even greater changes to areas as diverse as building construction, the production of drawings, the administration of both construction work and architectural drawing, even the development of land use, zoning, and real estate development. Design, obviously, being very much impacted by computing. I'm personally interested in the role of building documentation, whether it's the use of LiDAR or other kinds of technical means to trace the documentation of existing buildings. And then even the training and education of architects, and ultimately the training of education of everyone, might well be impacted by AI as well. So rather than getting sucked up into the mechanism of the machine, I asked what would it mean for us to ask real questions, not just about the mechanization of architectural labor itself, but about the relationship between the different forms of labor at question. If automation is the transfer of work from humans to machines, then what is the nature of that transfer? What is the nature of the work being transferred? How do we decide what work gets transferred from humans to machines and what does not? And most importantly, who gets to make those decisions? So we have an opportunity to think through the relationship between human labor and machine labor, and to position machine labor to take up certain kinds of work if we so choose, and not others. Part of the question here then might be, what are the sort of equivalent 3Ds for AI? What is the equivalence of the dull, dangerous work? But central to fairly asking these kinds of questions about labor, we must first put ourselves into the space of this transfer of work. And what I mean by that is that there's a certain kind of protection that's involved when a researcher or a scientist or an academic like myself or a business leader proposes the use of AI to replace someone else's job. Would that same person propose the use of AI to replace their own job? Discussions then about the transfer of labor to machines should take place, assuming that each and every one of our own jobs is at stake, and to sort of think about how we might engage in that discussion a bit differently if we think about it in that way. So what might this kind of conversation look like if there isn't sort of an other who has a presumed dirty, dull, or dangerous job, but presumably my very own job that might sort of be impacted by AI? So ultimately with AI, then I propose we're contending with a new division of labor, a division between human workers and non-human workers. But also there's an existing division between physical labor and intellectual labor that AI forces us to contend with as well. And ultimately then what it means to cede intellectual and creative labor to machines, which frankly is what we're hearing, I think, the most about the use of AI in the last couple of years. Ultimately, we theoretically have the power to decide along which lines that divide might happen. So this means redefining labor in relation to the specific kinds of automation that come along with AI, the automation of intellectual labor and the automation of creative labor, and really contending with how we feel about that kind of automation. So it means asking questions like, what is the labor relation that we want? What kinds of work do we want to keep doing? Most importantly, who is this we? The we that I fit into might be different from the we anyone sort of listening to this might fit into by a whole manner of things. But I would say most importantly, in relation to the kind of work any one of us is engaging in. So these are the kinds of questions being posed by myself and by my colleague, Arash Adel at Princeton. Arash leads the ADR laboratory at Princeton, whereby they're investigating the technical division of labor between humans and machines. Rather than proposing an automated takeover of tasks, ADR's work is interested in how we might segment tasks, how we might determine what tasks are automated by machines versus what tasks remain within the province of human labor. So ADR is proposing a collaboration between human work and robotic work, an extension of which would perhaps propose 3 or more Ds for AI. In this way, we can allow humans to be creative and extend that creativity into new domains. One of the main projects that the lab is working on, which I found particularly interesting, is the use of this robotic arm to build a brick wall. Human-machine interaction is most evident in the human who programs the robotic movements or who's using sort of a controller to direct the machine. But sort of a very interesting issue came up here is that while the robotic arm could be incredibly precise with the placing of the brick, it was the mortaring between the brick that was a lot less precise and a lot more difficult to figure out. And of course, it turns out that mortaring is a very highly skilled endeavor. Everything ranging from determining the amount of mortar that gets to be placed, how much pressure is put onto the brick, and then the kind of pointing that happens following that up. And so it's fairly complex work. To say a technologist outside of the bricklaying profession, it might not appear to be complex work at all. So it offers up, however, a possibility and a different way of thinking about division of labor. Division of labor, not just between the engineer who designs the machine and the engineer and the machine who builds, but also perhaps different division of labor between different stages of the building process, where a machine might be able to sort of intervene in parts, but we might actually reserve certain parts for humans, not just based on whether or not it's physical labor or intellectual labor, but based on decisions we make, again, about what kinds of work we want to keep doing, and what kinds of work we don't want to keep doing, and more importantly, who is that we, who occupies that we. Here, I would say part of that we would have to be the bricklayers themselves, involved in discussions about the ways in which this robotic arm participates in the building of the brick wall, for example. So to this end, the use of robotics, machine learning, and AI to lay bricks, for example, isn't just about replicating complex human movements involved in laying a brick, but it's about the decision-making involved, about recognizing and respecting human skill, creativity, and ingenuity, and even recognizing and respecting physical labor and not presuming that physical labor is something to be sort of set aside and replaced completely by machines themselves. And so that the sort of the we sort of including the physical labor is an important part of the conversation to allow open and continued space for human input. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess I'm up last. Oops. Hold on. This thing up and running here. All right, am I sharing the right screen there? Yeah, I think I am. All right, so I'm the guy without the PhD here, so I want to say that I think both Professor Cephas and Professor Steenson's work is super interesting on this front. I got re-involved in this question a couple of years ago when the Royal Institute of British Architects asked me to write this book on the implications of AI for the practice of architecture. And as I understand it, Molly, I think they originally asked Neil Leach to write this book and he refused. So they called me. And I realized when they asked me about this, to Molly's earlier point about AI not being so new, that I had studied as an undergraduate at Yale in the 1970s under a guy who turned out to be one of the founding fathers of natural language processing. But of course, the AI winter set in immediately thereafter, and we all sort of collectively forgot about all that work that had happened and why it was important. But to sort of emphasize Jay's earlier point about this idea about the division of physical and intellectual labor, that discussion, actually, that tradition goes back to the architectural theorist Leon Battista Alberti, who wrote it during the Renaissance that the creation of ideas and the making of things are two fundamentally human activities, but they're separate. That ideation and physical building are actually two separate phenomenon. And so the question becomes, at least in terms of the work that I'm interested in, what from that tradition of the sort of invention of the profession of architecture in the Renaissance, how have we sort of progressed as agents in systems that bridge between what Jay was calling intellectual versus physical work? Because that's really what we do as architects is help in the translation of intellectual ideas into physical ideas. And to frame that, I like to look at it through the lens of three separate questions. The first one is this question, who exactly is the architect? And this is a question that's thought through quite rigorously by my colleague, George Johnston, who teaches at Georgia Tech and wrote a very interesting book recently called Assembling the Architect, where he traces the history of the relationship between professional architects in the Americas and constructors. And he argues in that book that relationship about who actually does the things that need to happen to make architecture is a constantly evolving thing. And then the second question is one I ask my students all the time in a world where the financial and intellectual resources to actually finish a project are limited. How long does it take to have a good idea? What's the strategy for having a good idea? Because as an architect, you're supposed to have good ideas quickly, on schedule, and within budget. And then finally, the questions that are framed by the Suskins, who wrote this book called The Future of the Professions. And they ask, right now we have these people called architects or other professionals. What is it? What problems do we solve by having architects around? And are architects the best answers to solving those questions? And this really goes to, I think, both Molly and Jay's point about understanding where ideas are generated and kind of what and where they come from. And so George looks at this question by studying the relationship between the various aspects of labor that are necessary to execute a project historically. And he characterizes this question as one of mediated agency and collective intelligence. In other words, how does the agency of design get translated into construction? And where is all the intelligence necessary to sort of make that happen? And we saw some of that intelligence being explored in the Princeton Robotics Lab just now. But with the advent of all these different kinds of technologies, this idea of collective intelligence and whose agency is getting mediated I think is an interesting one. Now, Molly has done much more sophisticated work than I have on this question, but as a guy who used to have to do a lot of marketing presentations as a technology vendor, I have reduced the entire history of representational technology to one slide. Sorry, Molly, I want to apologize in advance. But one way, at least the way I look at this, is pretty straightforward. For 2,000 years, the problem of representation was people drawing things on pieces of paper. Simple, cheap, fast, high levels of abstraction. Starting in the early to mid 80s, mainstream adoption of drawing things with computers, in other words, using computers to draw things on pieces of paper, took hold. Then in 2008, we had the theoretical assertion of building information modeling, which was, in theory, a reversal of the paradigm. You made a three-dimensional representation of a building, and you extracted the drawings as a report. Right about now, we're entering into this thing I like to call the data interstice, which is many applications out there creating lots and lots of disorganized data all over the place, not largely related to one another. But I don't believe that we will see the serious implementation of artificial intelligence and for at least 5 more years, and I'll make the argument for why I think that's the case in a minute. Now, what we do have is a whole bunch of technological tools generating a whole bunch of heterogeneous, confused data all over the place. This is a slide I built from some work by my friend Jesse Devitt, who's a venture capitalist, and he follows all these different technology threads to try to figure out what's going on. But if you have all this stuff producing data, you need to have some theory of where these things might evolve. And my theory goes something like this. As architects and working with builders, there's a whole bunch of data being generated by the stuff in the green box down below. There's representational data from design. There's reality capture data like what Jay was referring to earlier. There's simulation and analytical data that comes from all sorts of tools. Our construction colleagues are generating tons of annotations and other kinds of records during construction. And the buildings themselves are creating huge flows of data. And if you could figure out some strategy to co-locate this and be smart about the way you deploy the technology, you could see enormous categories of things that AI might potentially help us with, like automating certain kinds of design tasks, systematically evaluating design decisions, automating construction like we saw going on at Princeton, or even autonomous building operation. But these are very large scale objectives for some kind of a system, even an artificial intelligence system, to actually work on. And so I started, when I wrote my book, I started asking, how might these things evolve? And I worked out with my friend Mark Graves, who's a computer scientist, a version of Bloom's taxonomy of learning that applies to AI. You know, those of us who are teachers know this sort of taxonomy of starting with teaching people to remember things and ending up with getting people to create things. And what Mark and I worked out was this idea that maybe if you could bring intelligent systems through a series of capabilities that started with comprehension, then evaluation, then simulation, then you could get to real robust creation. The problem with that taxonomy is the current technologies are attacking this problem in very discontinuous ways because they're using unexpurgated data that they don't understand, that they can barely evaluate, that skip over the entire idea of simulation and going directly to designing things. And what I think that really means is that many of these generative systems that you see today are provocative, but they're not interesting. They create provocations, but they don't create realistic output because the work that we do as architects exists in this right-hand part of this chart that I call the zone of complexity, where you have to integrate, understand, simulate, evaluate, do all these tasks. And it's very difficult for an algorithm to do that by memorizing the entire world, and you might create a series of unexpected outcomes. And so, Molly, I'm largely sympathetic with the criticisms that people like Gary Marcus bring forward, because I think that these systems don't really understand anything, and therefore they're very challenged. There are other challenges in the building industry that are very practical, like we got a whole lot of data and no data standards and no place to put it all and no way to organize it. So, you know, you can scrape all the word fragments off the internet and have an implied epistemology of language. There is no implied epistemology of the building industry, making it very challenging, in my view, to train these systems to do the complicated things that architects actually do. At the same time, another constraint, there are labor constraints and ethical constraints, but one that nobody's talking about except for Goldman Sachs at the moment is the constraint on electricity. The amount of electricity these things use is epic. There are some theories that suggest that artificial intelligence data centers are going to absorb all the clean energy in the United States in the foreseeable future. And it's a real constraint if they really think they're going to apply the kinds of computational intensities that are necessary to make these systems happen. But at the end of the day, the question becomes, at least the question that I'm really interested in, is what happens to the idea of professional architects that Alberti originally conceptualized. And what the Suskins argued in their book here, and this is a photograph of Benjamin Latrobe, who was the first practicing architect in the United States. And the Suskins essentially argue that advancing artificial intelligence will create degrees of automation that dismantle the professions. They say, first, there's going to be automation and ways of working will be streamlined. The second will be innovation around that automation. Systems will transform the work of professionals. And in the long run, a second future of transformation will prevail and our professions will be dismantled incrementally. And I think that's the existential question that the evolution of these systems raise. And what the Suskins argue is all the first generation innovators are going to work on just being more efficient. And that's really what you see right now. And Mona, I don't actually agree with your assertion that AI is deeply embedded in architectural practices. I mean, maybe on our iPhones, and people are using ChatGPT to do, marketing proposals, but you don't see a lot of sophisticated management of complex problems with AI. Now, it may be coming, and it may be, as the Suskins argue, that the second generation of innovators can disrupt the fundamental definition of professionalism and change the nature of the sale of the time of human experts. But I lean much more toward the Gary Marcuses of the world. And this guy, Jim Covello, who just wrote a report for Goldman Sachs a couple of weeks ago. Now, this guy used to be the head technology analyst at Goldman. He's now their head of equity research. And he asks the question about what are we getting for the $1 trillion that we've spent by 2030 on AI? Replacing low-wage jobs with tremendously costly technology is basically the polar opposite of prior technological transitions I've witnessed in my 30 years. And I struggle to believe that the technology will ever achieve the cognitive reasoning required to substantially augment or replace human interactions. And so this is a video I just got from these guys, Sketch Pro AI. Great tool. Can take my sketch and render it, can change my concrete into grass. These are not profound things. These are not complex things. And what we do as architects, especially what we do as architects is almost completely intellectual and very creative. And I think it's very hard for these systems to do this. That's not for lack of trying. This is a little site I follow called AI in AEC. These guys, have you seen this thing, Molly? These guys track so-called every AI-related startup in the AEC industry, and there's like 1,800 of them right now, and nobody's making any money. Nothing has any commercial traction. Nothing. Zero. And so the question through which I think we refract the way Jay framed this issue of labor is, what problems are we trying to solve, which architects are currently our best answer? And how does AI help clients get to the spatial solutions that they're actually looking for? And so I think what you're going to see is a particular set of evolution of these technologies that's going to come about in a certain way. This is my prognostication. What our friends from Goldman Sachs said is, you need 4 things to have successful AI: infrastructure, platforms, applications, and training data. So what you got right now is infrastructure, to go to Mona's original argument. You got a bunch of guys providing energy, big clusters of cloud GPUs, some machine learning algorithms, and you've stolen everything on the internet. And what you've gotten from that are a series of large language models, multimodal models, and a series of kind of weird little constricted applications that are somewhat dependent on user data, but are not really doing things that are super profound. They're helpful, they drive productivity, but they're not super profound. But what we need in order to move our industry forward is a new generation of foundation models that's based on our industry data that we can build our applications from and apply our project data to, because our problems are very constrained. Whether or not we can get to that point is a really interesting question, because the building industry is not one that's widely invested in or has a lot of technology infrastructure. So if we're stuck kind of in this zone and we never get to this zone, I think we're going to have the kinds of problems that my predecessors here have talked about. And so here's all the first generation innovation. Here's all the second generation innovation to use the Susskind's model. So I'll finish with the following thought about this whole question. I use this structure to sort of try to explain conceptually to my students what it is that architects do, right? We do four things fundamentally. We are the protector of the public's health, safety, and welfare. And we protect the public to create buildings that are usable and responsible. We act as an agent to the client to help mediate the systems of delivery to translate a design into a building. We act as a guide to a builder to turn the very abstract set of ideas that are represented in a drawing and a model into a physical thing. And we run teams of consultants and other people that assist in the design and construction process to make projects happen. None of these things can be replaced by an AI. None, zero. So the question really becomes, what's the responsible, clear, ethical strategy that can augment these roles and not replace them? Because I don't think they can be replaced. I think AI is very old, and it's had a 70-year head start, and we're still nowhere near being replaced by algorithms, at least in my view. Okay, Mona, over to you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, all three of you, for these very thought-provoking presentations. Molly, your take on generative AI, or the generative not being new, really struck me. And Jay, your sort of focus on labor and automation from sort of a historical point of view was really so interesting. And Phil, the zone of complexity and the relationship management and the human architect being the opposite of the uninteresting, not novel, not pushing forward aspects that AI brings to architectural practice really struck me. I'm going to ask a question that I was planning on asking at the end of this conversation. It just is kind of pressing for me now. And this is, by the way, a call for our audience members to please put their questions into the Q&A box. I will then direct them at our expert guests today. So all of you in some way spoke very, very clearly about the newness of AI, or challenged the newness of AI quite decidedly. All of you spoke about automation and about the impossibility of automating creative labor, and that being fundamentally what makes us human. And so my big question for you is, why does this shore up for you so strongly and concretely when I'm asking about AI in architecture? How is the these two entangled topics of old AI narratives, AI being old, and this sort of old story of automation, how does it show up so strongly in architecture, whereby we've always had sort of a division of labor between designers and builders, but also architecture being so physical? And we have a question about physicality and physical labor in in the Q&A. I'll get to that later. Why in architecture? Why? What made you think about AI being old and questions around automation, creativity, and labor in the context of architecture? Maybe if we can go Molly, Jay, and Phil. And for our audience members, I see some raised hands. If you could, we're not actually able to unmute you, so if you could put your questions, please, into the Q&A, that would be great. Thank you so much.
I think that you could see these in any number of fields, but I'll also point out that that question of creativity and artificial intelligence is also one that goes back to the 1950s or 60s. Daniel Cardoso-Jacques' book, Builders of the Vision, and other things that Daniel has looked at over the course of his research since at least 2012, has been on that topic of what is creative. And it's funny because Simon Lindgren's book right here, I just finished writing a book review of it, and he takes up the question of power and newness and creativity, but stops short and says, this isn't a book about creativity. And I think actually fundamentally our questions about AI are questions about what is creative, what is human, and what is not. And and then I'm going to be very, very, very curious about what Jay has to say around these questions of automation. One thing to note about newness, we did a study looking at 14,000 news articles. I think we stopped the study about 2 or 3 years ago. I'm trying to remember where we are in time. And the one thing we saw over and over and over is all of the rhetoric of AI is bound up in new. AI does not exist without new. I didn't answer your question about architecture.
No, you didn't. Why in architecture?
Okay, why in architecture? I'll take another historical example. There are several definitions of architecture in the OED, and the one that is not about things related to building has to do with a definition of architecture by Frederick Brooks, who's who created the notion of the mythical person month, and that idea came from the definition and the specifications of the IBM Stretch computer in the 1950s. It was a failure of a project for a supercomputer only to be resurrected as the IBM 360, which was the best-selling mainframe system for a very, very long time. So
I worked on one of those, I'm afraid I can admit. I'm so old.
And it made you the person you are today.
It certainly did.
Yeah, but that's this idea of a replicable architecture of thought, of a system being something not only of an architecture being not something that an architect makes, but that someone who creates a system makes. So I think this notion of architecture as in architects who design buildings and architects who design systems. I'm deeply interested in the architects who don't build things. And you mentioned Alberti. Phil, Boulez also had a similar notion of architecture as that which you conceptualize, that the conceptualization of thought.
Mm-hmm.
Jerry, what do you think?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. And to me, the answer lies in actually Phil's first slide about Alberti and architecture, the sort of history of architecture as it exists in the West and as I think current architects still see as part of their genealogy, goes back to defining the work of architecture as being distinct from the work of the builder. And a lot of that definition is about trying to create a clear delineation between intellectual and creative labor on one hand and physical labor on the other. Now, Alberti says that in the 16th century, but of course, architects do all kinds of work since then. And so what we see historically, at least, is that there's sort of two different narratives, if you will. There's the narrative that's sort of written into architectural history and theory that says, the architect is a creative being. This is the kind of work they do. And then there's the reality, which is that architects do lots of different things, and that there's sort of this continuing struggle, at least until, probably the middle of the 20th century or so, where architects are routinely trying to define themselves as distinct from builders and actually express a lot of frustration that they're not seen as distinct from builders, right? So even though that idea is sort of set up early on, there's a lot of struggle around it. And so I think that part of then why the sort of question of AI becomes so meaningful in a lot of ways in architecture, despite the fact, as Phil was suggesting, that there possibly isn't actually very much, at least usable AI, is because I do think that the architectural profession is still concerned with architecture asserting its role and asserting really control over that sort of intellectual and creative portion of work. And that a lot of the conversations about AI, particularly because the conversations happen among, I think typically happen among a certain kind of intellectual and educated class. A lot of the conversations on AI have been about applying AI, or in the past applying automation to taking over physical labor, which everyone seems fine with, mostly because those of us who are having that conversation don't do physical labor. But if most of us are doing intellectual and creative work, now we're concerned, and rightly so, because I think everybody should be concerned about all dimensions of it, right? And so it becomes a concern, I think, especially when the AI that does enter is perhaps not even doing things very well, or not doing things that are particularly useful or productive. But it's a concern when there is this kind of incursion onto a kind of work that people feel is not dirty, dull, or dangerous, right? But that is actually satisfying, and perhaps contributes good things to sort of our human world. And so I'm sure that there's other fields in which there might be sort of a similar combination that makes the sort of discussion around AI particularly potent, but that's my sense of why it's particularly potent within architecture.
Thanks so much, Dave. Phil, I'm curious to hear from you, because he also so pointedly pointed out that even buildings generate so much data at this moment. We are hearing all about smart buildings. All of our new buildings we put up at university campuses are all smart. What are your thoughts on why architecture is a good arena for discussing newness of AI and labor questions?
Well, as architects are not very circumspect, right? So, Molly's book, which was strongly influenced my thinking, it makes you realize how much interesting computational stuff architects have invented and then failed to leverage in any kind of way relative to their influence over the built environment, right? We created a lot of really interesting ideas, but didn't get to build a lot of stuff. A lot of those tools didn't really increase the agency of architects in the kinds of things that we're talking about. And at the end of the day, this question about the efficacy of these tools, at least as generative tools right now, for me boiled down to a very simple thing. An image is not a building. An image is not a building. An image is a bunch of pixels. It's not a building. A building is a very complex convergence of a lot of creative and synthetic and technical information that somebody has to be responsible for sorting through and making decisions for and taking responsibility for. And the current AI algorithms are not good at that. They're good at rearranging words on pages and rearranging pixels on screens and doing what appears to be vague deductive reasoning. But I mean, if you want to read a great moment of AI article to add to your collection, Molly, read the review of Apple Intelligence in today's Washington Post. It sucks. And this is Apple. They're what Goldman Sachs calls a hyperscaler, right? They're these guys that can afford an infinite number of $40,000 a piece GPUs and an infinite amount of compute.
But they don't get everything right.
Yeah, and they own they own the platform and all the data, and they still can't get it right. And I consider the problem of trying to figure out which is the most important email in my inbox to be much less complex than working out the code conformance of a building. And so, you know what, Jay, I've got 2 Ds for you, at least for the architects, or not the third one. I'll stick with dull, but let's add detailed, because a lot of the dull, detailed work is gonna get automated, like drawing, checking, coordination, door schedules, making sure the specs coordinated, kind of low intellectual engagement work, which is like the routine work of producing the stuff it takes to get a building on the street. that's where I'm most concerned about the labor force.
Yeah.
Because
So that's interesting, because that's precisely where automation always starts, right?
exactly.
Is that sort of routine work. And so that's what's interesting about the AI hype now. I mean, as you showed in your sort of diagram, it's sort of leaping forward to this kind of whole other domain that's much more difficult to address, as opposed to these much more simplistic tasks. Although, you know, at the end of the day, there's still people um, who do that work, right? So the question for me is always, okay, so we can sort of sit here and say, well, those tasks should be automated, but the
Yeah.
people who are doing the work, what do they think about that?
I want to point out Emek Erdoğlu, who just finished his PhD at Carnegie Mellon, has finished a dissertation on labor and construction robotics. So it's parts historical, looking at the history of construction robotics, especially at CMU, the history of human-computer interaction, and then also, and there's an STS lens, but he's also doing ethnographic research
Hmm.
with participants in sheetrocking and other kinds of labor. So his last name is spelled Erdolu. He's a postdoc at Tulane, and he's very interested in these questions of labor. I love his work and love to recommend it to people.
Thanks so much, all. We have about 50 minutes left, and we have a ton of questions actually. So I'm going to pivot a little bit and bring our audience members into the room by way of bringing their questions in. And I'm going to start with one that's been with me as well as this conversation unfolded, which is about the binary of intellectual and physical labor, which one of our audience members says they feel that's problematic, especially vis-a-vis learning about body mind from disability studies, thinking, for example, about the built environment as often not entirely designed by architects, for example. So my question, Jay, I'm going to give this to you. How do you feel about that distinction between creative labor and physical labor as part of this authority that architecture is asserting and has always asserted across time vis-a-vis automation? You just spoke a little bit about that, but maybe you can talk to that a little bit more explicitly.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree that it is a problematic distinction because it's not an absolute one, and the distinction itself presumes that it's absolute. And it's actually, I'm really glad that question was asked, because in the work that I'm doing around this, I'm actually struggling with how to talk about this, and finding ways to articulate what I mean without falling sort of into the trap of this binary. Because the binary is something that's presented to us. It's been with us historically for a long time. But the reality of the work itself is that all labor is both intellectual and physical. But we've created sort of these distinctions, and that's maybe what I was trying to get into by showing the work of the ADR laboratory with the bricklaying, because essentially what comes up in that is that there is this kind of creative almost component, one can sort of think of it that way, to the mortaring of the bricks, right? That there is sort of an intellectual engagement with how to do that that is simpler than just saying we're going to sort of slab on the mortar and lay a brick on top. There's a complexity to the work that I think almost anyone involved in the trades knows this very intimately, right? Sort of all the kind of complex nuances of their work that is really just not understood by people who are outside of the trade. So I think ultimately that's one of the sort of challenges that arises up here, is about being able to both place sort of higher social value on physical labor. I think that's one thing that I see as a problem, is the lack of social value that's placed on physical labor, but also understanding the degree to which different kinds of work always involved. I mean, we are people who occupy bodies. Everything we do is physical. So every work that we engage in is physical in some way. And every work we engage in is intellectual in some way. But our way of sort of thinking about labor is really hinged around disentangling those two and seeing them as these sort of distinct categories. And so then I think that means then that is how AI, at least what I see in the discourse around it, that's how it's being understood in relation to the kind of work that it might intervene in, right? Or the kind of work I think about, and maybe this was in one of the images that Molly showed, that the cover of, I can't remember which magazine it was, that showed the sort of a Corbusier type of building that would be generated by AI, for example. Like, these are the kinds of things that it's being sort of applied to, is trying to figure out automatically how to sort of make it take over design, which is sort of precisely the kind of creative work that people enjoy, right? So there's a way in which the discourse around it is reinforcing that sort of intellectual physical bindery. I find myself trying to not sort of fall into that trap, but it's hard to talk about it without using those same terms at the same time. So at any rate, I mean, I agree it's a problematic distinction, and sort of am interested in sort of different ways in engaging with it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jay. Just this morning, I read in our, industry publication about higher ed drive that Gen Z is more and more interested in the trades, and there's actually growth. So there's something interesting going on, I think, around working with your hands. But I have a question, Molly, for you, and then I have one for you, Phil. So Ahmed Arabi is saying AI is reshaping traditional methods in designing and constructing homes. And he's stipulating that this means a prioritization of efficiency and cost effectiveness. So he's saying, given that dwellings are more than physical spaces, they embody cultural, social, and psychological dimensions. How do you see AI systems integrating these human-centered elements in their design and construction processes? Molly, this one's for you.
Well, I might answer this and then throw in a little bit of a curve into it. One thing about any kind of AI system, AI-related system, large language model, style transfer is it needs to be trained on data. It doesn't exist without it. So you have to train it on something for something else to be generated, learned from, and regenerated. So a question there would be how is it trained and on what? There's a lot of question about the labor of people being, again, hoovered up by large language models without any consideration and then turned into something else. It's not very human-centered. It's not very creator-centered. A different take that I would, Mona, this kind of relates to something that you were just talking about the trades. Lately, when I've been talking about AI and generative AI and where we locate a human in a technologized world, I've been looking at the concept of slöjd, which is the Swedish term essentially for handcraft and handcraft pedagogy. It goes back to the 1870s. It's sort of similar to other things that happened at that time, Rudolf Steiner, Montessori, and so on. But basically a knowledge of hand, of craft, of self, of peripheral vision of the people around you, learning not from an example, but from those around you, and creating a knowledge of tool, material, and self. And one thing that I think is more important than ever, and why I think a place like us, which does a lot of work with handcraft and handcraft teaching, or why a trade school why trades are seeing an uptick, is because what we do with our hands matters, and matters as ourselves in an increasingly authoritarian mode of large language model predomination. So there's something really deeply, wonderfully subversive about craft. And about the personality and selfness of craft. And I'd argue too that if there's a question of artisan nature and the humanity of craft, there's something there to be learned.
And isn't that similar to the argument that was made and is still being made about hand drawing versus CAD versus modeling?
It could be, but I also think there's something there about a coming to understand what knowledge is, and that we work back and forth between 2 and 3 dimensions, that we work between an idea in our head and other ways that comes to be. So yeah, maybe it is. It makes me think of Frank Gehry not trusting the output of things he was designing in the 1980s and putting oh gosh, I'm going to bungle this in the time we've got, so I'll just skip it. But finding ways to take what was on a screen, build it into a model, and then put it back into CAD in order to trust what CAD was doing.
Right. Yeah. No, he absolutely did that. That's true.
Phil, I'm going to combine two questions for you, one from John Mikesh and one from Jeffrey Perrone. And so John is basically saying, well, and we just alluded to that a little bit, the kind of roles that are going to be automated in architecture are not the senior ones, the capital A architects, the principals, but folks who are renderers or who are in drafting roles, those are already quickly disappearing. And he's asking, how can architects prevent the profession from gradually fading away from the bottom up, not with a boom, but with a whisper? So that's John's question. I'm going to add Jeffrey's question to that, which is about tacit knowledge. And they're asking, does Polanyi's tacit knowledge cover the kinds of knowledge exercised in something like bricklaying? And if so, was that what quote unquote knowledge engineering, at least in part, was trying to get at back in the days of expert systems? So two questions for you, Phil, and then we're going to.
So someone's going to have to explain to me how those two questions are related, or am I supposed to answer them separately?
Separately, but
okay. Well, so I think the question about automation from the bottom up is definitely problematic. But I've seen this movie before because I was a junior architect in the days when CAD emerged. And then I saw the movie again when I was a vendor, right? Building technology. And what seems to happen in our profession is the complexity of the problem is always slightly out ahead of the tool's ability to automate it. And so the question is not just, are we solving the same problems with a new set of tools, but are there new problems, new things to work on, new questions that need to be answered, new deliverables that need to be created that obviate the need for junior people in certain kinds of roles, right? I mean, I was a really great drafter with plastic lead on Mylar. Most people don't even know what that means anymore, right? But as at the same time that those skills became obsolete, the projects that I worked on got much more complicated. You know, when I started my career, there was no such thing as sustainability. There was no such thing as digital fabrication. There was no such thing as understanding the supply chain. So the complexity, and I want to make one more philosophical observation as the oldest architect in the call here. Ever since I was a kid, it's felt as if my colleagues have talked about an existential crisis in architecture. It was always some topic that was causing existential angst. You know, when I was little, it was contractors. When I got out of grad school, it was lawyers. When I was a young project manager, it was construction managers. Now it's AI. There's always something that's threatening us. Yet somehow there's more architects in this country than there have ever been. It's harder to get into a decent architecture school like Princeton or Yale or Carnegie-Mellon than it's ever been. And there's plenty of work to be done. So can we like back off the existential angst just one notch here? Now, as for the other question, which is suddenly scrolled off my screen here, remind me what the other question was again?
Question was about
tacit knowledge.
Tacit knowledge bricklaying.
Right. So this question of tacit knowledge is super interesting because what the Suskins say is just because an algorithm does something in a way that's different than a human doesn't if the accomplishment and the output is the same, the difference in epistemology is irrelevant. So the question is for the bricklaying and the mortar, and I know what's happening right now, Jay, is that those students are using Robot Studio to simulate robot motion with those robots. Could you build a robust enough simulator and connect it to an AI so it could run 10 million simulations and build its own version of tacit knowledge? So if we had a simulation of a robot placing bricks and the behavior of mortar, could you just do it by trial and error the way AlphaGo learned how to play Go? So it built its own definition of tacit knowledge by brute force rather than experience. And that's, in a lot of cases, that's what's going to happen. I can show you a video of a simulator that Autodesk built that taught itself to build things out of Legos. It was given a pile of Legos and it just played with the pile of Legos for a week in a computer simulation and eventually figured out how to work with Legos. It created its own definition of tacit knowledge. Some of that's going to happen, but it's a long way from understanding tacitly how mortar works to being able to design a beautiful wall out of brick, or an appropriate wall, or a thermally insulated wall, or a wall that you can afford, or a wall that wasn't created by bricks made by enslaved people somewhere. It's a little more complicated than just the mortar and the bricks.
Thank you for that. Last question for all three of you. Rapid answer. When your students or the folks who come to your institution, in your case, Molly, and they want to learn about AI, architecture, the built environment, labor, design, what is the one thing you want them to take away?
It isn't new, and you should challenge these narratives that we're hearing that it's coming for you. It might be coming for you, but you've got to come up with your own way of engaging with this to make sense of it.
Thank you. Jay, the one thing.
But there's a long history behind all of these systems, and a lot of the questions that we're asking now have been asked before, and we can look back at that history actually to get a lot of the answers.
Thank you. And Phil.
What Molly said and what Jay said, but come at the problem as a designer. Think critically about what you're being told, and reflect on the history and the context that you're operating in, and use the skills you have as a designer to think through the problem.
Thank you. And there couldn't be better words to close us out. Thank you so much, Molly, Wright, Steenson, Jay Cephas, and Phil Bernstein, for your terrific contributions today, for this very lively discussion. A big thanks to our audience members. There were many more questions that were fielded, so we have a lot more potential for a lot more conversation. You can find Molly, Jay, and Phil online. They're doing terrific work. They've got books and essays coming out all the time, so go find them and connect with them directly. Big thanks to my team for facilitating our conversation today, and an invitation to all of you to return to the Co-opting AI space on November 7th for Co-opting AI Anatomy with Tom Champney, Rachel Prentice, and Jacqueline Vernimo. It's going to be an exciting conversation about AI's long-standing obsession with human anatomical features, from faces to fingerprints, and it will consider that legacy vis-a-vis AI's widespread use in various social institutions, including med schools. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and hopefully I will see you soon, latest on November 7th. Thank you, Molly, Jay, and Phil. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks all.
Thanks.